Cathy's been studying Wolverines since 2006, approximately. So she'll finish introducing herself in her talk, but I'm really excited to actually have her here and speaking on this topic. So we don't get to learn much about Wolverines very often. So thanks.
I guess, so I'm told this is on. Can people in the back hear me okay? Okay, so I'll try to stay close. So thanks for having me, and you guys look like a friendly crowd, so the homemade, I know Michelle, it was a surprise to her to have these technical difficulties, but hopefully you'll be able to see what's on the slides, and I think most of my information is above the fold there. I work for the research branch of the U.S. Forest Service called the Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Olympia, and I'm going to share with you what I've learned about wolverines. And let's see. So I'm going to be saying we a lot in this talk because I am part of a team that's been studying wolverines since, well, we really started in 2005. And so I wanted to acknowledge them before I go forward, and let's see. Oh, okay, I am getting used to what's the pointer. So Keith Aubrey is also with the research station, like myself, and he was the lead on our 10-year study, which I'm going to be talking about primarily. John Rohrer is a wildlife biologist over on the Winthrop, the Methow Valley Ranger District in Winthrop, which is on the Okanagan National Forest, and he ran our winter trapping crew for 10 years with assistance from our state partner, Scott Fitkin, who's also out of Winthrop, Washington. And there have been so many people that worked on this study over the 10 years, the trapping crews, people at the Forest Service employees at the Methow Valley Ranger District supported us in a variety of ways. There were always volunteers, lists of volunteers, and just a lot of people that dedicated a lot of time and effort. And there's no way that this kind of study could be accomplished without that. So I'll get it down. So I kind of divided the talk into 3 parts today. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to wolverine life history and distribution, and then talk about the 10-year study we did in the North Cascades looking at distribution and ecology. And then at the end I'll finish with just some current and future challenges for wolverine in conservation in Washington. Can I do this from back? There we go. So the life history and distribution of wolverines. Their scientific name is gulo gulo, probably from the Latin word of gulosus, which means gluttonous. And in the past, especially during the era of fur trapping, they were referred to by many names, including the glutton, because they were observed to have a very voracious appetite, and also skunk bear, because they do sort of resemble a small bear, but they also have anal glands that secrete a very pungent, musky-smelling substance that they scent mark with. They are the largest land-dwelling member of the weasel family, which also includes fisher, mink, marten. And wolverines are primarily scavengers, which probably most people don't realize. They also hunt live prey, but they are primarily scavengers. And throughout their range, ungulates are their primary food. They feed on the carcasses or carrion of ungulates that die from natural causes or killed by other predators. And they scavenge year-round, but this is particularly important for them during the winter and spring. And then in the summer is when when we see them hunt live prey more frequently. And it could be the young of the ungulate species in the area, or smaller mammals like marmots and snowshoe hares. Wolverines are active year-round. They don't hibernate, and they are very adapted for survival in cold and snowy environments. As I said, they resemble a small bear, and they have thick, insulating fur, and they have a muscular build and large feet, and these large feet kind of act as snowshoes, and it helps them traverse in snowy terrain and deep snowpack. They also have the musculature associated with their jaws. I need to move. With their, okay, that's not. The musculature associated with their jaws, along with their dentition, gives them the ability to eat frozen meat and bones. And they also have a very keen sense of smell and reportedly can smell carrion underneath the snowpack and thus dig down to get it and feed on it. So other characteristics, they have this lateral stripe that can vary from being very blonde and prominent to being much darker and almost indiscernible. They have a bushy tail, but it's relatively short compared to the length of their body. And then some other things, some wolverines have that lighter face mask, but that's pretty variable. But all wolverines have some degree of markings on their throat and chest area. The markings are sometimes almost white, and they're unique to individuals, so we can use these markings to tell individuals apart. And they also climb trees pretty well. They have slightly curved claws to help with that, and basically wherever a wolverine wants to go, they can pretty much get there. The males are about 30 to 40% larger than females, and their weights range from 27 to 40 pounds, and females then are between 18 and 27 pounds. But it's really difficult if you see a wolverine in the wild or get a photograph of them to tell whether it's a male or female, unless you get lucky and get two together and there's enough views to figure out that. I'm going to get those buttons confused all night, you guys. This one is larger, this one's smaller, so we figured there was a male and female there. So some other characteristics. Wolverines are polygynous, and so they mate with several females. The males mate with several different females. Males become sexually mature at 2 years, so that's when they typically start breeding. But females don't typically reproduce until they're 3 years old. And mating happens in the summer months. Females have what's called delayed implantation, where the fertilized egg does some initial development, but then it goes basically into a dormant stage until sometime in December or January when it then implants in the uterine wall. And after a gestation period of about 50 days, the females give birth to kits. And in our area, it seems to be late February to early March. With 1 to 3 kits, I think 1 to 2 are probably more normal. Females locate their reproductive dens under structures like rocks or down trees that are buried underneath the snowpack, and so they tunnel down to those structures under the snowpack. And I'll go into more details about that later. But that's where they give birth to and then nurse the kits until about 10 weeks of age, when the kits are weaned and able to move around more. And this video is courtesy of some of our colleagues at the Rocky Mountain Research Station when they were doing work in Glacier on reproductive status and success of their females that they were tracking. So there is audio, but I'm not sure how to turn the audio on. Is there audio on? Is it the mute?
No, it's not on. They don't teach us how to run this.
It's not as critical with this one, but later
Left
on
turn
there's
left,
one.
top. There we go, maybe.
Try it again. There we go. So this is a kit. This is it's almost at the age of weaning, and they wait that late when they're doing this kind of work because if the female then moves the kits, it's not posing as great a risk to the kits because they're older.
At least it sounds sweet.
Yeah. So in the wild, the average lifespan of wolverines is thought to be about 8 to 10 years, which is agreeing with some of our data, though we do have individuals that were at least 11 years old by the time we ended our study. But overall, female wolverines have a relatively low reproductive rate, and that's based on a combination of not only their average lifespan, but the fact that they don't typically reproduce until they're 3 years old. And also, most females don't reproduce every year. So something to think about when we're talking about wolverine conservation and survival. They have a circumpolar distribution, and they occur in the Arctic, the subarctic, and boreal forests of the northern hemisphere at naturally low densities. And this is probably because they are occupying these very, very low productivity habitats, and they're scavengers. And that kind of food resource is very spotty, and they probably need to cover a lot of ground to find enough food for survival. Our region here, you can see, is at the southern extent, close to the southern extent of wolverine distribution. And in the Cascades here, they occur in the alpine and the subalpine zones. So to better understand their current distribution, it helps to look at historical distribution. And I borrowed this map from one of Keith's publications. I'll just tell you, the map includes the whole U.S., and I've cropped it because I just wanted to focus on our region. But you can see wolverines historically occurred in the Cascades in Washington. There wasn't much presence in Oregon, so they're not sure if there were historical populations there, but there was an isolated population in California and then various populations in the Rocky Mountains. But what we know now from additional work that Keith was involved in with other collaborators is that the historical wolverine populations in the lower 48 were extirpated by the early 1900s. They disappeared. And the modern day populations that we have now are likely descendants of recent immigrations from the north, probably. So this decline and extirpation of wolverines was primarily due to unregulated trapping and predator control campaigns where they used poison baits and trapping to get rid of predators. But also, wolverines weren't valued for their fur like fisher, mink, marten. They were more viewed as a nuisance and a varmint because they liked to raid the trappers' trap lines. They'd go for the bait in the traps as well as the animals that got trapped. So they were raiding both things. They were infamous for breaking into cabins to get at food storage. So they were considered a nuisance, and that led to more kind of unregulated killing of wolverines. So in Washington, starting in the later part of the 20th century, we started getting occasional verifiable wolverine records. Verifiable meaning there's some sort of physical evidence associated with them, like a photograph, or in the case here in the slide, this was a female that was killed near Acme in, I think it was 1996, somewhere there. But it still wasn't clear if these occasional records were from wolverines from other regions making long-distance exploratory movements, or if it represented resident population. So that kind of brings us to the beginning of when we started this study. And in 2005, when we were in the planning stages, we still didn't know if there was a resident population of wolverines in Washington. But like I said, there were occasional records, especially in the North Cascades. It appeared something might be going on, and so there was a lot of support for initiating a study to determine the status of wolverines in Washington, if they're here, what they're using. And I just want to point out, so it was a 10-year study. The field work was conducted from 2006 through 2015. And our study area, just point out, it did go up into British Columbia because wolverines know no boundaries. And we actually collaborated with biologists up in BC, and I'll show you, they helped run some traps for a few years. And our all our field work, which was winter trapping, was based out of Winthrop, Washington, on the east side of the Cascades. So when we started, because we didn't know anything about wolverines in Washington, hardly anything, we had 3 really broad objectives. We were starting from square one. First, we just wanted to determine the status, population status of wolverines in the North Cascades. So is there a resident population, and is breeding occurring? Is reproduction occurring? Second, to determine the distribution and the genetic affinities of wolverines in this region. So are they genetically similar, dissimilar to the most adjacent populations elsewhere? And then if we could determine broad-scale habitat relationships and, if possible, information on reproductive dens. So to accomplish these kind of objectives in the North Cascades, which is very remote and inaccessible, we needed to live trap wolverines and outfit them with satellite telemetry collars. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute here. We tracked wolverines once we got them captured and a satellite collar on. We tracked their movements year-round to delineate their home ranges, and when possible to locate reproductive dens of reproductive females. We also collected tissue samples from captured wolverine to do genetic analyses, and we put little small flexible plastic ear tags in their ear, and when it's like piercing an ear. And by doing that, we get a little plug of tissue, which was enough DNA for genetic analyses. And then we also, this wasn't a main part of our research, but I wanted to show you an example of remotely triggered camera stations, and we used them to monitor our study population, as well as identify new individuals that we could target for live trapping. But this is a method that's used, is the most common method used to survey forest carnivores. And so when I talk about monitoring wolverines in the future, I just wanted to give you an idea of one of the most common methods used to do that. So quickly, how's this looking? This is a different look at our study area, and I wanted to talk about the access that we did and did not have. So the yellow squares are the locations of our live traps across 10 years that we didn't operate them all each year, but you can see that there are some up in British Columbia that were maybe operated anywhere from 2 to 4 years maybe during our study. And what I wanted to point out was that there were only 2 roads that crossed the North Cascades. Highway 3 up in British Columbia, and it's open year-round. And then, of course, there's the North Cascades Highway, which is this, and it's closed during winter, and that's it. And then all the shaded area is designated wilderness. So it's either North Cascades National Park or designated wilderness on Forest Service lands. There are unroaded areas, and all types of motorized access is restricted. Yeah.
Is there a reason we didn't trap within the wilderness areas, or is that
Oh,
Wolverines just hadn't chosen those areas yet?
good question. Hold that thought. That's what I am gonna answer that question right now. So, there's no motorized access no roads, but you can't even snowmobile into the wilderness. And that's pretty rugged area, but that is where we thought most of the wolverines occurred. So the only way we could really get access is to trap around the fringe of this area, hope we could, that they were making enough movements that they would reach our traps. And that was the primary reason that we chose to use satellite collars. Satellite collars, if you're familiar with radio telemetry of wildlife, satellite collars are a little bit different. They don't require that you have somebody on the ground with an antenna running around trying to find the animal's signal and tracking them. Instead, it works with a system of satellites called Argos satellites. There's 6 of them that orbit the Earth at low elevation, and they're for collecting environmental data if you have Argos-compatible transmitters, which is what our telemetry collars were. So the collars transmit a signal that's recognized by one of the Argos satellites, and when it gets the signal, it actually uses the Doppler effect to calculate the location of the collar. So the change in the collar's frequency as the satellite moves away from it. And that's about as far as my physics go. But the instrumentation and programming that is on board the satellites allows it to do those calculations, and then it downloads the data to one of the Argos processing centers, and there's one in North America. And then they make the data available to us through a secure website portal. And literally within 2 hours, we can look and see where our animals have been if the satellite got a signal. And so it was almost real time that we could monitor our animals. And of course, we got all the data, that you downloaded it all so that we could use it in analyses. But that way, we could track wolverines wherever they went. If we got them in the trap, got a collar on them, it didn't matter where they go, we would be able to pick them up. And so that was critical in an area like this that is so inaccessible. Did that answer your? Okay. So the next series of slides are just some slides of our traps, the field work, and how we captured wolverines. We used these, they're called log cabin style traps. They were built on site by the crews, and they're made from about 4 or 5 inch logs. They have to be big because wolverines are big, and we need a wolverine to go completely in the trap, so its tail or hindquarters, aren't anywhere near the opening when that lid goes down. And the logs are big because wolverines are very capable of chewing and clawing their way out of a trap. And so by having bigger logs, there's typically no way they can chew their way out faster than we can get up to the trap. So that's how that worked. And it's just, once they're captured, it's a very safe, it keeps them safe. There's protection from bad weather, so it works well. So I'm going to describe how the traps work, and hopefully you can still hear me. This is the front. The back, you can see these cables. There's the cable that goes from the back up to this top log and secured here, and then another one at the front of the top log that goes to the lid opening. And at the very back of the trap, a piece of bait used roadkill deer and beaver, typically for bait. It's wired in the back of the trap and secured with a cable. And that cable goes out the back of the trap, comes up here. You can't see it, but there's a trigger mechanism there. And then there's another cable that goes up to this pole. And what happens, the wolverine goes in the trap, and when it pulls on that bait, the trigger releases, releasing this, and the lid comes down. So depending on where our traps were located and the type of winter we had, there could be anywhere from 4 to, I think the record was over 15 feet of snow. So the crews are doing a lot of digging. We have to keep the A wolverine can't get in a trap if it's buried in the snow. And you can see we had trap transmitters on our traps. And towards the latter part of the study, these were all satellite trap transmitters. So when the trap was triggered, I'd get an email, or you could get a text message. And technology is really great sometimes. Just a few pictures of the conditions the crews were working in, and me occasionally, but it is the we. This is the infamous Dead Horse Pass on the road up to Hart's Pass out of Mazama that's prone to rock slides. And this is later in the season when the snow's melting away and we're losing our access. And again, just lots of snow and digging out, getting snowmobiles loaded down with gear across deep, fresh snow, getting people over avalanche slides safely, digging out avalanche slides to create a path for the snowmobiles. It took a lot of hard work, and it was a great group of folks that did this work all winter long. And it was all for this. So if you saw the movement as soon as he went in, this was one of our males, Logan, that was him yanking on that bait. And they usually don't go in this quick, and we had videos, the cameras that we place at the trap to monitor things were set to just take like 10-second videos. So there was a series of videos before this of Logan coming in, sniffing around, checking things out, deciding what he was going to do, and he finally went in the trap. And this is what we like to see, that email with trap triggered. And before John corrals everybody, they usually send a scout just to make sure it's actually a wolverine and not something else. And then a crew is gathered to go up to the trap and begin processing as soon as possible. Once they get to the trap, there's a bit of organization. Usually a table is carved out of snow so that, have a table to lay the wolverine down on and all the equipment. We used, if anybody is familiar with immobilization drugs, we used a combination of ketamine and medetomidine to immobilize the wolverines, and that was delivered with a jab stick. And typically, depending on the animal, it would take 10, 15 minutes, sometimes longer, for the animal to go completely under. And then it was removed from the trap, and the work of processing began, which included monitoring the animal's respiration, heart rate, temperature, as well as doing standard measurements, weighing them, looking at health condition. We examined their teeth. They could give us a really general idea of age, but it also gave us an idea of their health. And we also had a set of standard photos we took, including one of their throat and neck area for individual identification, so we could have a catalog of all the individuals we captured, and if they were, if wolverines were detected at camera stations, we could always refer to the photos we had to see if it was a known individual or a new one. And this is just a look at some of the variation and markings among the wolverines that we captured. It can really be quite variable. Rocky was our first male, and he didn't have very many markings, but still that little patch under his chin is unique. So it's pretty interesting, and some of them are literally quite beautiful. So the processing typically took about 45 minutes before the drugs start to wear off, and then the wolverine's placed back in the trap. We do use a reversal drug to help with the recovery time. And then whoever the processing crew is, we stay there until we're absolutely sure that the wolverine is fully recovered. And typically a couple hours, but sometimes it was longer. It just depended on the Wolverine, and I think there was a couple cases where the Wolverine just was too comfortable and didn't want to leave. So finally just propped the lid open and let it sleep, and, it just wanted to hang out there. But this is one of our females, Melanie, that's being released, and you can see the satellite collar on her, and there's a little picture to give you the idea of the size. So this is the last male that we captured of the study, Special K. It was Super Bowl Sunday, 2015. And Special K, and this does have pretty good audio. Wolverines have a very low rumble growl that is, you can almost feel the vibrations. It's impressive. So Wolverines have this reputation of being really ferocious. It's a myth. It is. Yes, they growl, and certainly if you tried to put your hand in there, they wouldn't like it. But they don't, they're not aggressive towards humans. But they are, I would call them tenacious. They are scavengers. They have to, when they find a carcass, they have to be very tenacious and fight off other predators. And I would describe their personality, that they're not these fierce, aggressive towards human species. But maybe with a growl like that, that's all you need to do. So this is just a very quick and small example to show you the data we get from Argos. I said the satellites calculate the location. We get it in lat long. That's these. We get a date and time stamp with it, the Wolverine caller's ID. I changed it to the Wolverine's name, and a bunch of other information, including some error estimates. And I plotted the locations on Google Earth. They don't come to me like that. But on this morning, by plotting and knowing the date and time, we can see the direction of movement and how far they're covering, what kind of ground they're covering in certain amounts of time. So this is the last method technique I was going to talk about just real quickly, remote camera stations, and perhaps many of you have heard of them before. They use trail cameras that are remotely triggered when they detect motion within their field of view. And there's many different designs that are used, and the design of the camera station depends on the objective of your project, and the designs can be simple to more complex, like ours here. This is called a run pole camera station. Unfortunately, it's a straight-on view, but there's a log attached to this tree that comes straight out, and then there's a brace down to the ground. And there's a bait hanging above the end of the run pole. It's out of the view of the camera. And there's also a scent lure at the site to attract, hopefully, a wolverine. And what it does is it entices the wolverine to crawl up on the run pole and go out to the end of it and look up at the bait. And when it does, we get a picture of its unique markings, and that's what we were going after. We also had the frame that you can see on it. That frame has alligator clips on it. And when the wolverine or another animal brushes those clips snap shut, grabbing a clump of hair, which is a genetic sample that we can do genetic analyses with. And then the frame that's at the very end here, that gives wolverines a way to even climb up higher to the bait, even though we try to put it just out of their reach. Because when they do, first, this is just another example of one of our females. and getting another picture of her unique markings. And when she climbs up, we can sometimes tell reproductive condition. So in this case, we can see that her teats are enlarged, they're nuzzle marks, so she's lactating and she's reproductive. But you don't always need a design like this, and they can be more simple, such as this one. This is a setup that was developed by one of our collaborators, Robert Long with Woodland Park Zoo. They put the cameras high up in the trees, and so they can put this kind of setup in the backcountry over winter, and the snowpack doesn't cover up the camera. And then they don't use food bait, they just use a scent lure. And they have that belt right there has gun brushes in it, which is another way to snag hair for genetic analyses. So these are the type of surveys that are, the type of setups, the methods that are used when we talk about, monitoring wolverines, surveying wolverines. So what did we find out over the 10 years? And I'll just summarize some of our key findings, and then I'll give you some more details about some of them. First, we captured 14 different individuals, 7 males and 7 females, and we identified 2 additional wolverines, so total 16, but we didn't capture them. Another male and female. We do have genetics on them, but we didn't track them. So we did establish there is a resident population in the North Cascades, and reproduction is occurring. Wolverines had large activity areas, and their locations were associated with areas that have snow cover that persists into late spring, and I'll be talking about this quite a bit more in a little bit. We located the reproductive dens for 2 females, and these were the first dens ever found, Wolverine dens ever found in this region. But just last year, one of our colleagues, Jocelyn Akins with the Cascade Carnivore Project, found a Wolverine reproductive den in the Cayuse Pass area. And that's the first evidence we have that wolverines have really established themselves south of the I-90 corridor, and reproduction is occurring in that area. So we have 3 dens for Washington now. And the genetic analysis we've done so far have revealed that wolverines in Washington are genetically distinct from those that occur in the Rocky Mountains of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And that was a pretty significant finding. And from those results, we know that wolverines here and wolverines in the Rocky Mountains haven't had any genetic interchange or connectivity for quite some time. And finally, the results from our study, as well as other survey efforts and information, indicates that wolverines are recolonizing. They're still recolonizing the Cascades in Washington, possibly from individuals immigrating south from wolverine populations in the coastal mountains of British Columbia. But that is one of our hypotheses that we're going to be testing with genetic analyses, and it's a collaborative group of which Jeff Lewis is a part of and many other people. So just looking at some more details for our results, I said wolverines had large activity areas, and I want to explain what this is showing. So each polygon, each one's a different color, and it's a different individual. And the polygon includes all the locations we obtained on that individual for a given year. And this is everything across the 10 years. So all these wolverines did not exist on the landscape together at the same time. But what it does show is the area that they are using in the North Cascades. And what was interesting to us is when we captured new animals that stayed in our area, they used areas that had been vacated by a previous animal. And then, of course, there was some overlap between males and females, and I'll show you a couple of examples here in a minute. But first, just how big were they? Females with kits had the smallest activity areas, ranging from 113 to 248 square miles. Then if they weren't reproductive, their areas were larger, 207 to 780 square miles, and males had the largest ranges, going from, 400 something to over 1,000 square miles. So they're using pretty large areas. And wolverines do typically use large areas, though what we're seeing may be a little bit larger than in some regions. So for some examples, if you remember earlier, I said wolverines are polygamous and males mate with several females. And this is what it looks like. Those males, their home ranges, activity areas overlap those of the females that they're mating with. And in this particular year, we had Rocky, Mallory, and Xena all collared. This was the year that both Mallory and Xena were reproductive, and we were able to find their reproductive dens. And Rocky's, he just completely, his area completely encompassed those two females, and he wasn't going anywhere else. And what's interesting, the next year we captured a subadult male in Xena's area, and shortly after that, we picked him and Rocky up traveling together, which indicates that Rocky was likely his father, and sure enough, the genetics came back, and Xena and Rocky could very well be the parents of that particular male. Another year, though, things were different. Mallory and Xena were still there. We just didn't have them collared, but we did have another female up in British Columbia collared, Melanie. And Rocky was covering all three females, and this was he was using an area that was over 1,000 square miles. And then just to take a look at the females, when the year that Xena was reproductive had a den, so reproductive females are more tied to, they're using this den for several months when their kits are real small. When their kits can start to move around, they can't move around a lot, so their movements are kind of constrained. But the next year, she wasn't reproductive, and her area doubled in size. So the point is that the location and extent of areas used by individual wolverines is dynamic, and it's at least in part influenced by reproductive status of individuals, and I'm sure the available food resources also influences the areas they use. We also had a couple examples of long-distance movements that were really interesting. A subadult female, A1. Again. Is the pink. She traveled over 300 miles. That's not meters, it's miles. 300 miles in 2 months' time. And when she got up here, she started to settle in, and it's an area known as the Lillooet Range that's starting to get in that coastal mountain region of British Columbia. And I'll talk about her a little bit more in a minute. The other one, Chance, he traveled over 350 miles in 3 months, and some of his route coincided with areas that A01 had traveled, but he did a lot more out and back type of explorations, and then came back to the northern portion of our study area and appeared to be settling in there, but then his collar died, so we don't know what happened, what that outcome was. A01, on the other hand, just start by saying we know wolverines can make long-distance movements. There's records of other movements that are quite long. But there may be costs to those movements. And for A01, unfortunately, there was a big cost. She didn't make it. So after she settled into that area, we got a signal from her collar that it was no longer moving, which meant she'd either slipped her collar or she was dead. And at the time, our colleagues up in BC were doing some helicopter flights, so they were able to go and isolate the location of her collar, and in the spring after snow melt, they went in and they found her remains, and her skull had been crushed open, and there was a deer carcass there, and there were cougar scats. So we pieced together the story, and a possibility is she had a confrontation with a cougar at a deer carcass, and she didn't win. So these long distance movements, which in her case was probably a dispersal event, wasn't successful. So jumping to the reproductive dens we found, and just a little bit on how we found them. Unfortunately, with the satellite collars, if the wolverine is under a solid structure like a rock or trees or whatever, that blocks the signal of the collar, so the satellites can't find that collar. So we could never get a precise location with the satellite data. But we could tell that 2 of our females were doing some strange movements. There were long periods of time where we wouldn't get any data. So we had these areas of interest. And then what we did is we did some helicopter flights to go look for wolverine tracks. And wolverine tracks that indicated that an area was getting repeated use. And you probably can't see it, but there's a wolverine track there, and there were other tracks on the other side of that stand indicating that there may be repeated use. So the next step is to find a place where the helicopter can land, which they did. And John and Scott were on this flight. And so then they went off to backtrack those wolverine tracks and see what they could find. And they did, in fact, find a den in that stand of trees where that arrow's pointing. And this is what they found. They saw this big mound of snow. This was in late April. And when they were there, there was still 10 feet of snow on the ground. And you can see that there is the entrance to the den. It was a round hole tunnel that went down into the snow. So they put a camera up, and when they came back, it may have been like a month later when they came back, we did capture video. It wasn't very good video, but we could tell it was Xena, and she was moving one kit from the den. So we waited until the summer to come back and see what she was actually using and get measurements. And it was that big rock structure was what was underneath that mound with like 10 feet of snow on top of it. And she was using the space underneath those rocks as a den. And so in situations like this, we do habitat measurements, but we also do a pretty systematic search of not only the den, but the surrounding area for scats and prey remains. And the scats we can analyze with genetics and later hopefully do some food habits. And just this den, this using rock structures and some, this is similar to other dens that have been found for wolverines in North America and elsewhere. So the next den was Mallory's, and it was isolated. Saw some wolverine tracks in the snow at the very edge of this stand at the bottom of an avalanche chute. And in this case, I was on the flight with John, and the helicopter could not find a big enough or safe enough place to land. So, but Scott, who works for the state, has a little more flexibility than us Forest Service folks when it comes to flying. And he was able to get a smaller helicopter and went back with some crew. And they hiked in, and they did find a den in that location. The entrance you can't see, but it's down in that hole with the tree. And this was in early May, and there was still 8 feet of snow on the ground. And Mallory had actually already left this site. They put up a camera anyway, and the camera picked her coming back, just checking things out. And it also, Rocky came by and checked things out. And yeah, I guess that was all I had to say there. But later that summer, a crew hiked in and just found this debris field of snapped and down trees. And when we look at the aerial photos, the avalanche had happened just a couple of years earlier, but there were all sorts of spaces underneath this debris field that the trees were, 4 to 6 feet off the ground.
Kathy, a couple questions. They start denning as soon as they're about to deliver, or do they den?
Yes, they do. We noticed them. One seemed to start denning right at the end of February, and the other one in early March. So, based on what we know about their reproductive cycle, the embryo implanted, sometime in December, January. It has an active pregnancy period, and then I'm sure they've already selected a den site, but they don't start staying in. We assume they don't start staying in the den until right before they give birth. And
Means they have to find their site in the summertime or when there's no snow and then relocate it when
Y-
there's 10 feet plus snow.
yeah, but you can be sure, given that they're scavengers and they're looking for carcasses, they're caching parts of carcasses in places. In fact, there's documentation of females caching food near their den site so they can have it later. So you can be sure they know their area pretty well, and they may have several potential sites picked out, and just maybe conditions or food resources will determine which one they use. So yeah, that space that they found under where it was clear that the female and kits had been in there, and again, a search for scats and habitat measurements. So I have one more result to give you some details on, but I need to talk about this paper first. This is a paper that came out a few years after our study started. Keith was one of the co-authors, and it was a group of Wolverine researchers that did this work. And what they did is they looked at a couple of environmental variables that they thought might limit the distribution of wolverines across their range. And one of those was snow cover that persists into late spring from mid-April to mid-April, and that's the latter part of the denning period, with the idea being that females need snow for denning, and so perhaps, the presence of late spring snow that coincides with denning might be an important environmental condition for wolverines and where they occur. The other thing they looked at was maximum summer temperature. I think it was maximum August temperature. So wolverines are a cold-adapted species, and the idea being that perhaps some areas get too warm for wolverines to do well, and thus might limit their distribution. And then they collected all the known locations of reproductive dens in North America, Scandinavia, and Eurasia. And they looked at the locations of those dens in relation to this late spring snow cover data and maximum temperature, and 100% of all the known wolverine dens occurred in areas that had snow cover that persisted into late spring. And not only that, they then also collected telemetry data from research studies in all these three regions, telemetry data for both males and females, locations during winter and other times of year, including summer. And the vast majority of all those locations, it was something like at least 86% of all those locations, also fell in areas that have spring snow, that has snow cover persisting into late spring. So they concluded that that environmental condition was a good predictor of where wolverines occur. So here's a map of that snow data. The blue so the snow data covered a 7-year period, and the shades of blue are just representing the number of years out of 7 where there was snow cover persisting on the ground into that late spring period. And this is our study area. And when we plot all of our telemetry data from our 10-year study, 91% of them fall in areas that have this late spring snow cover. So it seems to be a good predictor of wolverine occurrence and, as a result of potential wolverine habitat in the North Cascades ecosystem. But we do want to test this in a more rigorous way, so we're involved in a modeling project right now where we're looking at snow cover as well as other environmental variables that might be important to wolverines, like temperature, elevation, some kind of human footprint as well, perhaps density of roads and things like that, to see if the late spring snow cover is still the best predictor of wolverine occurrence and thus a good habitat model, or is there another suite of environmental variables that perform better? And finally, just to go over this association with snow. Why are wolverines so associated with snow? We know they're adapted to those kind of environments, but why do we see all this relationship with not just females denning? Because we know that females require deep snow to locate their dens, and it's thought that doing that increases the survival of young by providing thermal cover for the young as well as protecting them from potential predators. So there's a lot of evidence to support that relationship. But what about other times of the year? In the summer, the snow is gone from those areas, but areas that do have snow persisting into late spring likely reflect cooler climate conditions or microclimate conditions year-round. So some other hypotheses out there, one is called the refrigerator zone, and it's got a lot of support. And we were just talking about wolverines caching food. So they do cache food during all seasons, and caching food in these cool microsites prohibits spoilage and would also protect food from other predators. So that might be a part of the reason that they're associated with these areas. And the other one, again, is avoiding thermal stress. At least in some portions of their study area, avoidance of high summer temperatures may explain why they remain in these cool microclimates. And of course, it could be all of these factors combined as well as others that we're not aware of and we're still trying to figure out. So the last thing before getting on to, current and future challenges is just to take a look at the current distribution of wolverines. Where are we now? And this is not only the results from our study, but the results from other survey efforts that other people have done, and opportunistic sightings of wolverines. And they're not just sightings, we call them verifiable records. Again, there's physical evidence associated with them, a photograph, genetic data. And this is where we were the 5 years before we started the study in the North Cascades. There was just a handful of records in the years 2000 to 2005. And here we are today. Yes, there's being more survey done, but even at the time we started our study, there had already been a lot of surveys in the North Cascades looking for wolverine and coming up empty. So the evidence clearly supports that we are witnessing and still witnessing a recolonization of wolverines in the North Cascades. And as I mentioned, we're hypothesizing that it's coming from dispersal from populations in the coastal mountains of southwestern BC. And there are efforts to look at that with additional genetic analyses. And this is the yellow circles are records for which we have genetic data. So we now have genetic data from north to south in Washington. And again, all the Wolverines genotyped in Washington so far are genetically distinct from those in the Rocky Mountains of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. So now that we know all this stuff about Wolverines, what kinds of things are we talking about when we're looking at challenges for their survival into the future? And at first, I just wanted to point out a couple of current issues that need to keep in mind. And one of this is the recolonization that's going on. You can think of it as a natural experiment that's happening, and we don't know if it's going to be successful yet. So yes, the Wolverines are coming, we're seeing them more, but it's going to take many Wolverine generations before we know if the Cascades can provide enough habitat to sustain Wolverines, or, you know, if it's not the entire Cascades in Washington, you know, is there a portion of the Cascades that seem to be able to support a population over time? So monitoring is going to be necessary, and there are collaborative efforts to develop the most effective way to monitor Wolverines in Washington in order to detect changes in their distribution as well as changes in population trends. Are they still increasing, declining? And also, there's a new study that the paper just came out last month. I just read it the other week. I need to read it again. It's from work in the Rocky Mountains, where they found that both motorized and unmotorized winter recreation has a negative impact on Wolverines, particularly females. It effectively decreases their habitat quality. And there was always concern and some indicators that maybe Wolverines avoided areas where there was a lot of human activity. But this is a very unique study, and the first one to look at it directly. They actually quantified winter recreation by giving snowmobilers, backcountry skiers, everybody that was out there, GPS units. So they tracked the places where winter recreation was occurring as well as the intensity, and at the same time they were tracking Wolverines so they could see how the things interacted. So this gives us some new information to think about, and you know, there may be new studies that want to replicate this kind of work to see if these types of interactions are the same in other regions, but it's new information that we didn't have before. So in thinking about potential effects of climate change, of course, and future changes that might pose challenges for Wolverine survival, I kind of summarized it in I looked at 3 themes, I guess, and I'll talk about each one here. First, in thinking about areas of snow cover that persist into spring, that seems to be important. So given the predictions of warmer temperatures, to what extent will spring snow cover or the size of habitat blocks, patches, whatever you want to call them, the size of habitat available to Wolverine, how might it be altered? And some of the information I'm going to talk about comes from a publication, and I'll give the citation, but basically it's predicted that the extent of areas with spring snow cover, late spring snow cover, i.e. Wolverine habitat, is expected to decline in our region, the western U.S., with habitat areas becoming more fragmented and isolated. And it's likely to result in a decrease in denning habitat, which of course is always a concern if it is, you know, would that decrease actually affect reproduction and population stability. And there is prediction that that Wolverine habitat will likely be greatly reduced by the end of the 21st century, but there'll still be some relatively large islands of spring snow cover that persist, including in the northern Cascades. And if we think about this then in the terms of connectivity, to what extent will climate change alter the degree of connectivity between habitat and between other populations of wolverine? As wolverine habitat becomes more fragmented, connectivity between adjacent areas of habitat decreases, meaning the distance between adjacent areas increase and may become too far, or the energetic cost may become too great for wolverines to successfully disperse. And this can lead to small, isolated populations. And without connectivity to other wolverine populations to facilitate dispersal and genetic exchange, that wolverines tend to have local extirpations. And again, a lot of this work comes from publication by McKelvey, and Keith's one of the authors as well. And just to kind of help visualize what this means, this is back to the snow cover layer, but it's zoomed out so that it not only shows our region, but adjacent regions. So there's all the verifiable detections we have from 2000 to 2018. And you can see, if we're just looking at snow cover, which we think is describing potential wolverine habitat, you can see that how connected we are to those coastal mountains in southwestern British Columbia, which is where we hypothesize our population came from. So if that turns out to be true, then connectivity between Washington and the northern areas will be important. But as under these predictions that these areas of snow cover start to decline and become more fragmented and isolated, you can imagine in some areas these patches disappearing, or perhaps bigger gaps opening up. And there's a variety of scenarios, but you can start to see how that might change the look of the landscape. But for our region, it seems, at least at this point, until we have more information, keeping connectivity with those northern areas that have big islands of habitat. That, remember, the prediction was that some big islands of habitat will still remain by the end of the 21st century. And that would be up here, but it also mentioned the North Cascades. So with that, then the last one is the human disturbance factor. And I just wanted to find a map that showed the human footprint, and I just found this one really quick, but it kind of does the trick. It's a combination of land use and roads. And we all know that, we have a very urban populated area on the west side of the Cascades, but our population is growing on both the west and the east side. And we also know that people in Washington really love to recreate, and they all go to the Cascades. So even without climate change, as our population grows, the pressure on the North Cascades for recreation and access is likely to increase. And again, the new information that we have that winter recreation may be a disturbance to wolverine gives us something to think about how, might strategize to minimize those types of impacts. And then climate change comes along and decreases the amount of snow and opens up access to the mountains even more, so people can get higher up in elevation. The length of time of year that they have available to access the mountains may be longer, and that could be an additional impact on wolverines. And you can see a human footprint. That's the I-90 corridor. And if increased population also increases roads across the Cascades or whatever, that could also have an impact on connectivity. But on the brighter side, we may be a little unique in the Cascades compared to some other areas where wolverines occur. All the dark and gray are designated wilderness. First of all, most of the Cascades is federal land. And then you have all these big chunks of wilderness area that already have restrictions, like I mentioned before. There's restricted motorized access. And this is where wolverines occur. This is where they occur now. Those are the areas that they use the most. So I think there's good prospects for looking ahead and being able to start to strategize about how to maintain and even enhance connectivity. And with the wilderness areas, I think that gives us a leg up on that, those discussions. And there are discussions going on already about all these issues, and lots of state, federal, non-government organizations working together on wolverines as well as other species. So that's it for me. And any questions? I don't know if Michelle, she's going to hand you a microphone.
I was wondering, what is the lowest elevation that you found wolverines?
Actually, I don't know if I have the lowest elevation, but because they can make exploratory movements, we have found them. They do come down in elevation. Jeff has good. Yeah, what's the elevation of North Bend? There was a wolverine detection this last year. Unfortunately, it was then hit on I-90. So in these long distance exploratory movements, wolverines are they're found in sagebrush. I mean, when some of these go on these long walkabouts, they end up in areas that are not wolverine habitat, but they're not going to stay there. And so further north, where it's colder, they're down to sea level. They could be down to sea level. So it really has to do with the climate of the area. And for us here, of course, the cooler climates are higher elevation, but they will come a little bit lower in the wintertime, but they certainly don't, resident animals certainly don't migrate, like use higher elevations in the winter and come down lower in the summer or vice versa.
I have a couple questions about their reproduction, and if you know of any, is this working? If you know of hypotheses as to why they have such low reproduction, is it related to the low population density, and so that I don't know if the populations in the Rockies have a higher population density, but are the females skipping years where they don't reproduce simply because they didn't access a mate? Or is there something about their physiology that they have low fecundity and they can only reproduce every other year or something?
Yeah. Across their range, they have relatively low reproductive rates. A lot of carnivores, larger animals do. But to answer your question, they do, from one of the works I was reading on this, they do have information that females may mate every year, but they don't necessarily give birth to kits. So one of the theories for delayed implantation for a species like this is that, they mate, the egg is fertilized, but it doesn't start developing. And then over winter, the food resources the female finds, whatever her health condition ends up being, will determine whether that pregnancy goes through. So it may be a way to, they're scavengers. Food can be scarce. I have seen that starvation in wolverines is not uncommon. So sometimes food is hard to find, and that can be related to their reproductive output, and so that they only give birth to kits when the female is in good condition. Because if she's not in good condition and goes through all that, then it puts her at risk. And so it might just be a fitness strategy.
Thank you.
They can have, I've seen they can have 3, I think 1 to 3 is the range. I don't know if it's higher. We saw one that, with one of our females, the reproductive den that our colleague found this last year, there were 2 kits. And there's been opportunistic photos from backcountry users just this past year of what looks like a female with 2 kits in the glacier, the general larger glacier peak area. So I think 1 to 2, at least in our region, is probably more normal. 3, when resources are really plentiful, females healthy can support that many young.
How many total do you estimate in Washington State?
It's very hard to do that, especially since things are in flux. But the numbers we're using are somewhere between 25 and 50. But remember, they occur in low densities, so we don't expect there to be high numbers ever in the Cascades.
Cathy, if you repeat the question, then we don't have to use the mic.
Okay. Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I'll repeat the next one. Thompson.
I just was struck by the 2 graphics you had of the 2000, 2005 occurrences, and then the great increase in the apparent numbers or sightings later. And at the same time, there's more human population occurring during that time. What was happening in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s for Wolverines? Is that known, or I guess what's the longer picture of their recolonization?
Well, the work that was done they actually looked at the genetics of wolverines in historical populations, so they were able to go back to museum specimens and get genetics and look at modern day population genetics. And that's how they determined that the wolverines that occurred in the 1800s and early 1900s were extirpated. They disappeared. So when recolonization started is unclear. After the early 1900s, there were occasional records of wolverines in Washington. There was, I looked at it recently, there were a few in the 60s. I think there was one in the 50s. And those could have been long-distance movements, but it never amounted to anything, or the wolverines didn't make it. So I think that is we have some sense that in the 1990s, the latter part of the century, the records were always spotty and infrequent. And it's only been at the end of the 1900s, beginning of the 21st century, that we're finally starting to see an accumulation of records, and it appears that they're taking hold. Also, during the time of our study, when we first started, there was no indication that wolverines were getting south of I-90. There was, a few years after we started, there was one detection down in the Mount Adams area, and they believe that wolverine was detected over a period of several years, but nothing. And then a few years ago, we had a detection of another wolverine that was at Stampede Pass, got across I-90. Then we had another detection. So I think we're seeing this migration. They're getting further south in the Cascades, which is additional evidence that this recolonization is still happening. Did that answer your?
Can you tie that like to the increase in population? Does that
Human population?
counter what you were saying earlier, that there are more humans that are coming and yet the wolverines are successfully expanding?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think we know because, so he's saying we're having wolverines expanding. but our population is also expanding. So does that mean wolverines are doing fine with, all the recreation that's occurring in Washington? How do we resolve those potentially conflicting facts? And I think part of it is that when you have an expanding population, you really don't know. They're expanding faster than they're running into things that might restrict their ultimate occupation. And the same with climate change, because, temperatures are already warming. But here we have wolverines coming into Washington. It's the time scale things operate on. And I think in the Cascades, there's still lots, they're up in those wilderness areas, which there's more use up there, but, it's, maybe there's still enough room for both. We'll see.
I'm wondering about the collars, if they are designed to fall off after a certain period of time. And also wondering about the sedation, if it's a female, if it's safe, if she's
Pregnant.
babies.
The question about the sedation, the drugs that we use, they are, as far as we know, these are the types of drugs that are used in most studies, and there is information that indicates that they are safe for pregnant females. Of course, you don't know if you have a pregnant female. Even when we thought we had a pregnant female, she wasn't pregnant, and when we thought we didn't have a pregnant female, she ended up being pregnant. But there's no indication that these drugs interfere with that. They're very safe. The other question about the collars, we did not use collars that some people that use studies that use collars on animals, they call it a rot away section, so it'll eventually deteriorate and fall off, but those often deteriorate before you're ready for them to fall off. And what I didn't talk about is we actually worked with the company that makes those collars. It's a company in New Zealand, Surtrac, and when we were starting the study, we worked with them to design those collars so they were as light as possible. We know from other work that we've done, if the collar band is too wide, it can cause chafing. So we wanted those collars to, be as light as possible and not bother the wolverines as much as possible. And on the other hand, wolverines are infamous for taking collars off if they don't like them. They have large necks in relation to their head, so they can easily rip them off, and many studies go with implants instead of collars, but that's more invasive. You have to have a vet on board, and there's a lot of logistics with that. So we went with the collars. We wanted to track them. The collars last 8 months, and the model that we were using towards the end of the study lasted for over a year, so we couldn't risk putting rotaways in the collar and lose that information. And then also over the study, it was a long-term study, so over the years we were able to monitor how the wolverines were doing with these collars, and they weren't causing any problems. They weren't causing any chafing or wearing. And so they don't break off. They stay on, but eventually wolverines either slip them, or first the canister will come off, and then eventually they'll wear off. But even if they're on for several years, they seem to do fine. If we had had more access and we could retrap animals readily, we probably would have tried to retrap and take the collars off, but it wasn't possible. But we were also pretty confident that it wasn't causing any issues. And I mentioned at the beginning that actually tracking our study animals, our animals are living till 10, 11 years, so we don't see any. We've only had a couple of mortality events, like the one I showed you, the female that was killed by a cougar, and we had another young male that appeared to have been killed by a cougar, but no mortality in relation to our research methods, I think. Okay.
Yes, couple things. Early on, there was a question about the North Cascades Park, and it seems like there's a lot of habitat in there, but it's still not being used, particularly in the western part. Is that, do you expect that to become more colonized in future years?
Well, they are using, we have a lot of individuals that are using the southern part of the park. Ross Lake may be we have animals coming up to Ross Lake. To be on the other side of Ross Lake, they may need to, that may be a bit of a
Can we go back to the map, because this, I don't think Ross Lake was in the way of where I'm talking.
But I will say that, so we've always, maybe this will answer your question. So why aren't wolverines using North Cascades National Park more, at least the north half of it? We also wondered why people weren't finding wolverines in the Mount Baker area. We're now people are picking up wolverines in that area. And so maybe other parts of the park are next. And there was just a helicopter pilot. Jeff can relate. He's the one that got this sighting. Where was it, Jose?
3 miles south of Canada on the east side of Ross Lake, Wolverine feeding on a deer carcass.
Yeah. So for why they haven't been in these areas sooner, who knows? But we're starting to see them pop up in areas where people have been looking for them for a long time.
The second part of my question may be a bit naive, and I missed the first few minutes, but
This-
it looks like there's great habitat in Olympic National Park. Is that not their historical area?
They never occurred on the Olympic Peninsula. They just didn't get there. Yeah. Okay.
When you get your text or email, what does it take to mobilize people to get there? Do you say like 2 hours?
It depends on where the trap was and what time of day. Some of the traps are were a lot easier to access, quicker to access than others. Everybody that worked on the winter trapping crew was right out of Winthrop. And if they were already out checking traps, they might be closer to some, but usually somebody could get up there in a couple of hours. And then, they had radios. So everybody's already on standby at that point. And when they radio, it's a Wolverine, people are ready to come up. But those traps, once a Wolverine's in the log traps, they're safe for a while. They've got food to eat. They're protected from the weather. A couple of individuals started chewing, but most of them just hung out in the trap until we got there. They didn't seem to be too stressed. Yes?
As far as their northern range and their southern range, north of Washington and south, the theory that I heard you say is that thinking that the population that's coming from Washington is coming from the British coastal range. So is there evidence that there are resident populations out there? And if so, how much? And the related question to that is so well, I'll change that first. And then going south, do we know whether there are any in the Oregon Cascades or not?
So let me talk about north first. So there are wolverines. As you go north, wolverines become more common. And British Columbia has more wolverines than we do. There are wolverines in the coastal mountains of British Columbia and other places in British Columbia. We just don't have, we haven't gotten the genetic data yet. That's what we need to determine whether the population in Washington is coming from that particular area. So as you go north into British Columbia, Alaska, other parts of Canada, eastern Canada, wolverines occur there. Going south, wolverines, there have been a couple of wolverines detected in the Wallowas in northeastern Oregon. And I'm not sure how to go back, but not sure if I can go back. But one year, 3 wolverines were detected. They got genetics on one, and it was related to wolverines in Idaho. And if you look at that snow cover map, there is kind of fragmented connectivity to areas into the Rockies. There's no wolverines in the Oregon Cascades that we know of, but they've been searched pretty thoroughly for quite a while. So at least in the Pacific coastal states, Washington is at the southern extent of their range. And then there's the Wallowas in Oregon, where it's still not clear if, I think they keep detecting a wolverine occasionally there, but there's not a real big presence of wolverines there. Did that help?
Yeah, so that answered the question too for me of why there was no comparison genetically between the Washington Wolverines and the ones on the British coast, because you said you don't have any genetic information.
Yeah, and that's something there's a large collaborative effort right now. Samples are being analyzed, and so those analyses will be coming soon. So somebody, yeah. In the back, yeah.
Do you have any way to estimate how many wolverines there would have been in the North Cascades area historically, like prior to them being hunted?
I don't. Keith, one of the lead on our team, he's has more expertise with the historical records, but still it's very difficult to try and estimate populations from museum specimens and old records like that, so we don't really know.
One follow-up on that, in terms of what wolverines eat, are deer the most common thing that they're scavenging on, or do they have a preference, or are there other types of carcasses they're finding that are also common?
So in Washington, we actually know very little about their prey base. But we have deer, we have elk. Our colleague that is surveying wolverines south of I-90, I know they have been doing some backtracking this winter, and they found 2 elk carcasses that the wolverines were feeding on, and I hope I'm not releasing information that she didn't want me to. I think so in different regions, it depends on what ungulates are there. So in some regions, it's caribou. We have deer, we have some elk, occasional moose, there are some goats. I think if whatever they find, they'll eat it. I don't know that they have given a choice of ungulates. I've never heard that wolverines have a preference for one over the other. Yes? Yeah, they are. They do have established home range. They are known to be territorial, mark their range, protect males, establish their home range to get access to females. That's the theory. The females they breed with, and will be aggressive towards other males that may be trying to come in and get access to those females. We did have one of the males that we followed, Logan. The second year we recaptured him. He had been in quite a fight. He had wounds to his face, and I think the I wasn't there for that one, but both John and Scott are there for all of them. And I think the theory, and based on the wounds and teeth marks, they thought it could very well have been another Wolverine that he got in a fight with. But
It'd be interesting if those patches that you talk about get smaller and smaller, that you might actually see those populations getting closer and closer together.
yeah, I mean, there is, population theory. Small populations operate very differently than large populations, and things start to break down, start not to work very well. Yes.
I just wondered if they entertain the notion of doing any kind of restrictions on recreating to protect the habitat forms or anything
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
is there any restrictions for recreating that they could put to protect the habitat that's being proposed or thought of?
Thought about, perhaps. Proposed, no, because if you remember, the information that we have, the real evidence that we have that winter recreation in particular has a negative impact on wolverines is new. It just came out last month, this new study in the Rocky Mountains. So they're seeing some potential impact of winter recreation to wolverines there. So it's still so new that nobody's had a chance to really discuss it. Are the same kind of interactions going on in other regions? Or is it something specific to the Rocky Mountain areas? But I know people have always been a little concerned about it, especially as things like snowmobiles have gotten more powerful and they can get further into areas, and it's very popular. I know some of the rangers on the ranger districts are concerned about the intensity of winter recreation for a variety of reasons. So it's certainly it's a discussion out there, but there's no proposals to restrict it, especially since we don't have a lot of evidence quite yet. Yeah.
What about wildfires and potential effects on habitat and
We have had some wildfires in Wolverine, but I don't remember reading anything about Wolverine habitat and fire. I mean, they do occur in alpine and subalpine areas. I mean, they do use forests, but they also use areas that don't have much forest. So, the answer is, I don't know. I don't know. Yes?
So you mentioned that you've seen one of the adult males, I think it was Rocky with a sub-adult male,
Yes.
and so was that surprising? What can you tell us about that?
No, it's not. It's actually kind of cool. So it used to be that people thought of wolverines as very solitary, territorial. But now, over the past few years, compiling information from people that have done research on wolverines and tracked wolverines, they're actually much more social than we originally thought, and they do see interaction between males and their offspring. So traveling with a male offspring, a son or a daughter, is not uncommon. And it's not uncommon for subadults to hang out with their parents the next year. So there are social interactions going on more so than people originally thought. Yes.
So as we can see, obviously with more gathering of information, we can see that there has been an increase of the Wolverine population, not just in the Cascades, but also somewhat in the Rockies somewhat. Has there been a resighting of populations within the Sierra Nevadas as well?
They detected a wolverine in the Sierras. Do you remember the first year, Jeff?
2008, 2009.
Yeah, they detected, it was actually one of our colleagues. She was doing her master's work with camera stations for marten. And they started looking at the photos and went, that's not a marten. And they had detected a wolverine at one of their stations. He got a lot of publicity. I think his name is Buddy. Is that his name, Buddy? They have since continued to detect him year after year. I can't remember if he was detected last year, but as far as they know, they did get genetics on him. He's related to wolverines in Idaho. They don't know how he got there, but they do a lot of surveying for carnivores in the Sierra Nevada, and there's no other evidence of other wolverines so far.
The same thing happened in Colorado too, there's
Yep.
one male. Did you hear about that one? Yeah. They looked around, couldn't find another one to go with either of these two. Everybody's hopeful, but nothing. Really disappointing.
So that kind of goes back to Tom's question about, recolonization and when does it really start? There may be these long distance exploratory movements where individuals disperse these very long distances to an area and there's no other wolverine. Well, I don't know, Buddy may just stay in California and nothing ever happens, but maybe eventually there'll be another one or not. But it is amazing the movements they can make, but it doesn't always lead to some kind of a population event. Yeah.
Is it possible that, I mean, this is kind of on the edges, but that a person found a kind of kid, maybe the mother had been killed? Oh, mom, what a cute little baby, so aggressive. Gonna bring it home, oh, it's really aggressive now, so they just let it.
Oh, there are conspiracy theories out there. So anything's possible, but it was a wolverine from Idaho.
Thank you
So.
very